Our scripture reading this morning comes from Psalms chapter 33. So Psalms 33, and I'm going to read from verses 1 down to verse 22. Sing to the Lord, you who do what is right. Honest people should praise him. Praise the Lord on the harp. Make music for him on a 10-stringed lyre. Sing a new song to him. Play well and joyfully. God's word is true. The Lord's love fills the earth. The sky was made at the Lord's command. By the breath of his mouth he made all the stars. He gathered the water of the sea into a heap. He made the great oceans stay in its place. All the earth should worship the Lord. The whole world should fear him. He spoke and it happened. He commanded and it appeared. The Lord upsets the plans of nations. He ruins all their plans. But the Lord's plans will stand forever. His ideas will last from now on. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his very own. The Lord looks down from heaven and sees every person. From his throne he watches all who live on the earth. He made their hearts and understands everything they do. No king is saved by his great army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. Horses can't bring victory. They can't save by their strength. But the Lord looks after those who fear him, those who put their hope in his love. He saves them from death and spares their lives in times of hunger. So our hope is in the Lord. He is our help, our shield to protect us. We rejoice in him because we trust his holy name. Lord, show your love to us as we put our hope in you. Amen. Well, good morning again, everyone. It's lovely to see the sun shining. It was a beautiful start to the week. I got sunburnt on Monday. Just a little kind of bit of t-shirt sunburn on one side, but then the rest of the week after that has been fairly miserable, I think, in terms of weather. But it's lovely to see this morning. Looking at the forecast, though, I think just after lunch it starts raining again. Perfect for going out for a Sabbath afternoon walk, of course. It's fantastic. Now, as most of you know, I changed jobs kind of this year. Started a new role. And there are lots of things that are different between my old job and my current job. So there are things to do with the job itself in terms of this job is a lot quicker than the previous job. Whereas before I'd have 18 months to do one project, I've got half a dozen projects which will all be finished within the next month. And then I'll have another half a dozen projects. So it's a kind of a constant rolling thing. So it's very different in terms of pace. The number of things I have to keep track of at one time. My to-do list at my last place was 10, 12 things long. My to-do list at the moment is, there are more than one of them, and there must be 100 things on my to-do list that I need to get done. It's quite hard to keep on top of sometimes. The atmosphere in the office is very different. It's a very different kind of type of place to work. Even the fact that it's a much smaller building means that I'm parked much closer to the office and this kind of thing. So I have a thing that counts how many steps I do each day. So even just without doing anything special, at my last place I would easily do 7,000 steps a day. Now, if I just have a normal day and I'm not doing anything, if I don't go out for a walk or cycle or anything like that, I'll get 4,000 in a day just by it being such a smaller place. It's just less steps to walk to the toilet, to the canteen, to wherever you're going. One of the things that really changed the way I feel at work, though, at my last place, the computers were fairly open, so we were allowed to have our music on our computers. And so if I had to get something done, if it was like I have to get this document written, I have to get it out, then it would be right. Headphones in, volume up. Everyone leave me alone. I'm busy. And I could sit there and quite happily be typing away and kind of forget myself in my music. It was a decision that I'd made a few years ago now, that the music I was going to listen to, I wasn't going to listen to secular music anymore given the choice. So I made a choice, right, everything I'm going to listen to is going to be Christian. And that means, there is, of course, when you think about Christian music, there are so many different types and styles, and that's one of the beautiful things about music in general, is it fits your mood. So if you want something that's calming and peaceful, then there are lots of old hymns and even plenty of modern songs which are nice and slow and will kind of have that relaxing kind of thing. And then there are other times where you want to kind of go forward and you want to do something, and there are plenty of bouncy songs that you can listen to as well. And there's, of course, everything in between. And it really depends where you were. But my new job, not allowed to have any music on the computers. And it being a much smaller office as well, there's just less going on, so there's less kind of ambient noise, less hubbub going on, which means it's much harder for me to shut off everything around me and concentrate on what I'm doing on the occasions where I just have to plough through and do something. And the first thing to think about would I've got my phone, I can just use my phone, except that the headphone socket on my phone is broken. And I can't just have the music blaring out to everyone in the office. So for the first 3 months that I was at the job, I basically had no music whatsoever, which is kind of a weird thing for me, having been so used to it in the past, until I remembered that I had an old iPod with a 10-year-old iPod that I bought with a cracked screen, but it still works. And I dug it out, I charged it, I put the music I have now on it and took it to work. And so now I can happily sit there and drown out everything around me and be able to concentrate on what I'm supposed to be doing. But what that does mean, listening to music is a thing that, to listen to music properly, you really need to have few distractions. So when you're listening to a song, listening at home, if I buy an album and I'm listening to an album at home, I can't listen to the album at home. I can hear it, but I can't listen to it. So after leaving my old place in December, for the 3 months that I was at home before starting the new job, I heard lots of new music. I heard several new albums that I'd bought just because I know I like the artists, but I'd never really listened to them. And even then, the 3 months afterwards, when I was at my new job, I still wasn't able to listen properly to the music. So that meant I had 6 months of songs that I'd bought which I hadn't really listened to, and suddenly I was listening to them. And that meant that 2 weeks ago in the office, another thing about songs and about music, I don't know if you notice this as well, there are albums and there are songs which you'll listen to, and the first time you hear them, you fall in love with them. And you think, the words are mine, this is perfect, this is exactly how I'm feeling, this is exactly who I am. And you just fall in love with a song the first time you hear it. And then there are other ones where you hear it the first time and it's, and you hear it the second time, and then 6 months down the line, suddenly you burst out in tears as you realize that song is exactly the song that is you, and you fall in love with that song after having heard it dozens of times before, and suddenly you hear it in a different light and you recognize it. And there's one album particularly that I bought earlier this year that I'd listened to, and I'd even had it kind of in the office. I played it through a few times and hadn't really kind of done anything, but then there was one song that a couple of weeks ago, suddenly it hit me. And I was there almost in tears in the office because of this one song. And the one song, and it's called So Will I, but it's got it talks about three facets of who God is. And it does so over 3 verses. And I also happened to just be looking at the preaching plan and saw 3 holes in the preaching plan. And it occurred to me, I was inspired to do a series. So you'll notice my name's on the preaching plan 3 times over the next 5 weeks, I think it is. And I'm going to try and preach a series of sermons. So today is the first of 3 sermons on this subject, the overall theme of So Will I, as you'll see. And today we're going to look at the first verse of this. And the first verse, I'll read the words to you. God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time, with no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of life. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises, so will I. See, our story starts with in the beginning, or more correctly, in the beginning, God. Beginnings are very hard for us to be able to understand because we are finite, limited people. I am told, and I have a piece of paper that confirms this, that I was born a little over 34 years ago in a hospital in Watford. I have a piece of paper that tells me this. I can't remember it, so I have to believe that this piece of paper is telling me the truth. When you're inside, when it's your beginning, it's extremely hard to be able to understand, to be able to picture and to be able to grasp that. Even kind of from the outside, it depends on your level of involvement. So, for example, with Hadassah's birth and with Agatha's birth, my recollection of the events is probably much clearer even than Katya's, because I had, shall we say, a little bit less mind-altering pain going on at the time, so I was able to think a little more clearly and able to see and understand things. And it's not just people, the beginning of people as well. You think of other things that have beginnings. It was in 1990 that Tim Berners-Lee began, and he created what we now know as the World Wide Web, the internet as we can browse it. It was only 3 or 4 years after that. I was about 10, and I remember being at school, and in the headmaster's office there was a computer, and because we'd been studying about space, we sent an email to somebody in America about space. And I remember sitting there was two or three of us, I think, in the headmaster's office, as there was about 10 or something at the time. And the idea that we were writing something and somebody on the other side of the world would be able to read it almost immediately was incredible. But now in my pocket I have a device that has much more power than that. And as I'm speaking to you, is probably talking to computers all over the world, getting information, downloading emails, checking I have no notifications from somebody, no messages from friends in Brazil or any other part of the world. It's a kind of a crazy world that we live in, to think that there is so much of these things happening and so much connectedness. Yet, I know, well, pretty much everyone here will be able to remember a life before the internet. But for so many people today, it's hard to picture a life without it. Somebody who is growing up today are unlikely to know how to read a map to get anywhere a decent distance, like to travel across country, to be able to read a map to do that, because you don't need to. I've not had to do that for years. To make a call for an appointment or to order food or things like that, it's all just a couple of taps away in front of you, and you're able to do these things. And for so many people growing up today, that is the only way that they will ever have known. Let's give another example that's slightly older. So I was born in the early 80s, but the house that my parents lived in at the time, in the middle of Watford, so this is not kind of some rural area in the middle of nowhere, this is a large town still inside the M25, and the house that my parents lived in didn't have an indoor toilet. So the toilet was at the bottom of the garden, which I know some of you will have lived in houses like that. But, I mean, 100 years ago that was considered luxurious, to have your own toilet at the bottom of your own garden. Instead of having a public one on the corner of the street or something like that, you were able to have your own private toilet. But to think even in the 80s, inside towns, you're still having, and it wasn't just our house, it was the whole area was like this. This was a kind of very deprived part of Watford that got knocked down a couple of years later and turned into a much nicer part of Watford. But this was the place that that I was born in, and I don't remember it, but I can't picture living in a house like that unless I decide to give up on the rat race and go live in a hut somewhere in the middle of the jungle, somewhere much, much, much warmer than here. But that's the only way I could picture ever living in that kind of situation. The further back you go, you have to strip away a lot of what we take for granted to be able to understand how things were. So when we strip away central heating, we strip away cars, television, radio, the fact that we can have recorded music at all, light bulbs, textiles that don't itch, medicine, the rule of law, democracy, clocks, glass, even writing itself isn't that much older than the book of Genesis. This is if we want to go back to Bible times to try and understand really what was going on in people's minds, there is a lot of stuff that we have to forget about. A lot of stuff we have to ignore and put down. See, we talk about Genesis. Moses wrote the book of Genesis, is the way we understand it. And I've always understood that he wrote this while he was in Midian. So this is the 40 years he was looking after sheep in Midian before he went back to Egypt. So he wrote Genesis and he wrote Job during that time. Now Midian, this is kind of Jordan, northern end of Saudi Arabia. This is where it sits on the map. This is the kind of place, you see pictures of Petra, the wonderful city that was carved into the rock in that part. That's the kind of the area of the world we're talking about here. So we are talking fairly arid. We're talking beautiful red undulating ground and just the interplay of light, something that is such a beautiful part of the world. Now, can you imagine what it would be like for Moses at night to be there with the sheep? Because he wouldn't go home every day. They would go out with the sheep and they'd go around, and they'd go around for miles and miles and miles, and then come back a month later or something like that. So he would be there, and he'd be there camping in the desert. And because it's a desert, because it's a hot part of the world, he's able to be out there in the open. He doesn't have to have a tent or anything like that. So you can imagine him just lying down and looking up. Now, when we try that, if you try that, go sit in the glen at the middle of the night and lie down and look up, you'll see what? 4 stars? If you're lucky, just because of the amount of light pollution that there is in towns. You go up to the farthest reaches of the middle of nowhere up north, and if you can find a night when there's no cloud, you will see an awful lot more than that. But even so, it's the clarity that Moses would have been able to see the heavens at night, to be able to see this kind of thing, to be able to see the stars, to be able to see the wonders of the universe that God has created. That's a completely different thing. So, can you imagine lying down, like Jacob did, having a stone for a pillow and just looking up at something like that? How fantastic that must be. So if we imagine that, then perhaps we can begin to understand some of the things that Moses wrote. So I understand Moses was inspired to write the story of Job, who was probably a real man, genuinely existed quite some time before Moses. This was a story that was common, and he wrote it down. And the way he wrote it, in Hebrew, most of it is poetry. It is poetic prose, so it's not just he's written down a story. He is writing poetry that rhymes. It has a beat, it has a rhythm, it has flow, and he's using language that fits into that. Whether that's a word for word account of the exchange that took place. Personally, I don't think it was, but it captures the essence of what the conversation that Job had with his friends and with God. Because you get down to chapter 33 of Job, and chapter 38 of Job, and Job has been shaking his fist at the sky for quite some time, kind of arguing with God. We studied it in the lesson a couple of quarters ago. He's been there arguing against God and how God's been unfair with him. And so God comes down at the beginning of chapter 38. It starts off like this. Then the Lord answered Job from the storm. He said, "Who is this that makes my purpose unclear by saying things that are not true? Be strong like a man. I will ask you some questions, and you must answer me. Where were you when I made the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off how big it should be? Surely you know. Who stretched a ruler across it? What were the earth's foundations set on? Or who put its cornerstone in place when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted with joy? Who shut the doors to keep the sea in place when it broke through and was born? When I made the clouds like a coat and wrapped it in dark clouds, when I put limits on the sea and put its doors and bars in place, when I said to the sea, you must come this far but no further, this is where your proud waves must stop. Have you ever ordered the morning to begin, or shown the dawn where its place was in order to take hold of the earth by its edges and shake evil people out of it? At dawn the earth changes like clay being pressed by a seal. The hills and valleys stand out like folds of a coat. Light is not given to evil people. Their arm is raised to do harm, but it is broken. Have you ever gone to where the sea begins, or walked in the valleys under the sea? Have the gates of death been opened to you? Have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Do you understand how wide the earth is? Tell me if you know these things. What is the path to light's home, and where does darkness live? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the way to their homes? Surely you know if you were already born when all this happened. Have you lived that many years? Have you ever gone into the storehouses of the snow, or seen the storehouses for hail, which I save for time of trouble, for days of war and battle? Where is the place from which light comes? Where is the place from which the east wind blows over the earth? Who cuts a waterway for the heavy rains and sets a path for the sun thunderstorm? Who waters the land where no one lives, the desert that has no one in it? Who sends rain to satisfy the empty land so the grass begins to grow? Does the rain have a father? Who is father to the drops of dew? Who is the mother of the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the sky when the water becomes hard as stone and even the surface of the ocean is frozen? Can you tie up the stars of the Pleiades or loosen the ropes of the stars in Orion? Can you bring out the stars on time or lead out the stars of the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the sky and understand their rule over the earth? Can you shout an order to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Can you send lightning bolts on their way? Do they come to you and say, "Here we are"? Who put wisdom inside the mind or understanding in the heart? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can pour water from the jars of the sky when the dust becomes hard and the clumps of dirt stick together? Do you hunt food for the female lion to satisfy the hunger of the young lions, while they lie in their dens or hide in the bushes waiting to attack? Who gives food to the birds when their young cry out to God and wander about without food? Can you stop and contemplate the majesty of the God who is the creator of the universe without your head spinning? Job's response aptly to these kind of questions, these questions have no answer. We have no way to answer them. Job didn't then, and we don't have them today. Job's response in chapter 40, verses 1 to 5, the Lord said to Job, "Will the person who argues with the Almighty correct him? Let the person who accuses God answer him." And then Job answered the Lord, "I am not worthy. I cannot answer anything. So I'll put my hand over my mouth. I spoke one time, but I will not answer again. I even spoke 2 times, but I will not say anything more." See, when you keep asking yourself why and how, you can go through a never-ending series of questions. Science hardly scratches the surface of what can be known, and the beauty that there is, the deeper you go into the workings of the universe, the stronger it points to the creator of it all. Isaac Newton, in his book, The Principia, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, he wrote, "This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and a powerful being." And Newton had a very limited view of the world because he didn't have anywhere close to the technology that we had today. He was ahead of his time, but his time was a long time ago. Because we have telescopes that are able to see to the farthest reaches of the universe, and we have tunneling microscopes that can see down to words that have been written in ink that is only 1 atom thick, and I've seen it done. You can read things that are so minuscule and so tiny, and we can see things that are so massive and so far away from where we are. And we ask the question, why is the sky blue? At least most of the time it's blue. The simple answer is refraction of the mixed wavelength light from the sun as it comes through the atmosphere, which makes it look blue, even though the atmosphere itself doesn't actually have any colour. To go into more detail, you can measure the index of refraction of the different wavelengths of visible light in sunlight through the different mixtures and densities of air that there is at all the different altitudes, the different temperatures and different weather patterns that we have. You can end up with some very, very complicated equations to try and describe the way that light travels from the sun and it meets you in the eye. Now, already that's complicated, but that's still only the start. So we can say to the neuroscientist, okay, the light gets to our eyes, we can understand how it gets converted to an electrical signal. How does that get to our brain? Why does our brain see pictures? How do we see what we're seeing? Because it's just signals. There's nothing really there. And the best the neuroscientists can say is, You ask a physicist, why does refraction occur? Why, when you get close to something, does it bend? So it's where you get close to the edge and something, light bends around things. And again, the question is, there's very limited answers that they can give, because it's all to do with the speed of light. Or why is the speed of light the speed of light? And there are no things there. And we just asked one simple question. Well, how about at sunset when the sky is pink? Why does the sky go pink? Pink isn't actually even a real colour. It's a figment of our imagination, and that's crazy. You look at the spectrum of colours, the rainbow of colours, there is no pink. There is no magenta. It doesn't exist. Yet, I see pink, I see pink. How does this work? We don't know. It's an inventive thing that our brain cooks up. See, when you're asking questions like that, there's a parable told of an old woman who had this belief that the earth was flat and that the earth travelled around space on the back of an elephant. And so she was asked, so what's the elephant standing on? I was like, oh, another elephant. Well, what's that elephant standing on? Another elephant. But hang on, Sonny. Let me save you some time. It's elephants all the way down. We can lose ourselves trying to count the elephants going down, and science tries to do that. It is a fantastic thing, and it can very much bring us closer to God. And we know that there are more than a few scientists who started off as atheists, but who later became Christians because of the science that they saw. An example of that is Alan Sandage, very, very highly respected cosmologist, probably the most influential cosmologist of the second half of the 20th century, fellow of the Royal Society. He was a protege of Edwin Hubble. Fantastically intelligent man, and in 1983 he became a Christian, and he became a young earth creationist. He believes that the earth is only 6,000-ish years old. In fact, he said, it was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It was only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence. Now, God put that inquiry into our hearts, that curiosity to find out and to discover more. When we think about the earliest seafarers, the peoples of the Pacific Ocean, crossing the Pacific Ocean with no maps, no idea, and they're able to find this tiny speck of an island in the middle of nowhere. How that is even possible, yet they did so. And we get to today where we're trying to put people onto Mars and trying to set up a colony on Mars. We could spend the whole day here just talking about the infinite wonder that there is in the created universe, and how that shows us and points us towards God and to God's infinite power, his loving character. And we can even explore the merits of how far we should dive into that. We can also explore the merits of when it's time to stop diving into it and sit back and enjoy it, and enjoy the beauty and the wonder that God has left us and that God has placed all around us. But then my question would be, what's the point? That's not much of a sermon, if that is the only thing, just to sit there and ooh, God did some cool things. So let me read that first verse of the song again for you and see if we can pull out a reason for this. So God at creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time, with no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've made, every burning star a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your praises, so will I. The point here is not just the awe of what God has created out of nothing, with no other artwork to copy from. And it's not just the vastness of creation and the force and power that there is in God's voice. It is our response to that. In Psalm 33 that we read earlier, David said, "The sky was made at the Lord's command. By the breath from his mouth, he made all the stars. He gathered the water in the sea into a heap. He made the great ocean stay in its place." All the earth should worship the Lord. The whole world should fear him. He spoke and it happened. He commanded and it appeared. You see, creation sings God's glory. And this is a theme that we find throughout the Bible. Let me give you some other examples. As we read a little bit earlier, Moses wrote in Job that the morning stars sang for joy. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Revelation 5, and I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. Isaiah 55, the mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. And Nehemiah 9, the host of heaven worships you. Purely because of the act of creation, God is worthy of all love, glory, honor, and praise. And the thing is, creation understands that. The Bible is full of these indications, and we can see it for ourselves. The stars, the animals, and everything else in this universe points to their creator in praise. It seems the only creature that doesn't is man. Why is that? And more importantly, when are we going to wake up and start doing what we are supposed to do? When the ark was brought to Jerusalem and was placed in the tabernacle that David had created there, that David had made there, as part of the dedication service, he sang a song that he'd been inspired to write. You can read it in 1 Chronicles 16, verses. I'm going to read from 28 to 33. Praise the Lord, all nations on earth. Praise the Lord's glory and power. Praise the glory of the Lord's name. Bring an offering and come to him. Worship the Lord because he is holy. Tremble before him, everyone on earth. The earth is set and it cannot be moved. Let the skies rejoice and the earth be glad. Let people everywhere say, the Lord is king. Let the sea and everything in it shout. Let the fields and everything in them rejoice. Then the trees of the forest will sing for joy before the Lord. See, David's instruction is for everything, us included, to worship God as our creator. The rest of creation understands that. The beauty that we see around us points to something more than chance, something more than laws that have no intelligence of their own, with no thought or care. If you wanted to, you could take the theory of evolution and you can use it to explain things that are useful. You can put it things that are traits that will help us to survive better as individuals or as a society. You can do that with evolution. But it can never explain abstract notions such as the beauty that there is in the heavens. Jonathan Swift, an Irish philosopher, once said that the universe was formed by a fortuitous concourse of atoms. I will no more believe than that the accidental jumbling of the alphabet would fall into the most ingenious treatise of philosophy. Science cannot tell us how ice skates work. It cannot tell us how sand flows or where static comes from. Yet, when you recognize the love that has gone into every flower petal, every bird's feather, every blade of grass in a swaying meadow, every wisp of cloud floating across the sky, there is nothing you can do but respond. We're told to stop and smell the roses, but that is something we do far too rarely. We live and we work and we pass our lives in clogged up cities, and we don't see what Moses saw. We miss out on the smells of the countryside, the hum of the insects and the swaying of the branches in the breeze. Even the smell of wet earth after a dry spell is like breathing in life. I don't think I've ever been anywhere remote enough to be able to see the sky as Moses saw it. But I've seen enough of creation to know who my Creator is, to know who my God is, and what kind of God He is. Our call is to worship Him as our Creator. I mean, that's a big part of what Sabbath is. The recognition that our God is big enough to have spoken all matters into existence, to have called all the beauty that we see into existence from nothing but His imagination, to have lovingly sculpted our first parents from the elements that are around us that we take for granted so much, and to have rested after that, not because He was tired, but to be with us. If we accept that, we must worship Him. We must give ourselves to Him. We must respond even before He has done, before anything else that He has done or that He is going to do for us. See, Moses worshipped God in the wilderness before he ever saw a burning bush. He was not yet somebody who was expecting the Jewish people to be saved from Egypt. He worshipped with Jethro, his father-in-law, who was the high priest of Midian. The Midianites were also descendants of Abraham via his third wife, Keturah. There were several other tribes from Keturah as well, not to mention all the tribes of the Ishmaelites. Many of those tribes kept a relatively pure form of pre-Mosaic worship for a long time after Abraham. They lost it in stages, and eventually most of them were wiped out when Canaan was taken over by the Israelites after they left Egypt. But at this point, there was still some worship of the true God there. And that was where Moses was. That was where Moses found his God, and that's where he was in the middle of the wilderness looking after sheep. He was there looking up into the same sky that Jacob looked up to when he saw the ladder connecting heaven and earth. It was the same sky that later on Elijah would look up to and would see the small black cloud coming as the answer to his prayer. And it's the same sky that the disciples kept looking up into even after Jesus had disappeared from their sight. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims His handiwork. And so will I. Moses was called to something different in the midst of nature. He learned to worship his Creator, and he was able to recognize in what was around him what he was learning from Jethro in terms of the story and the history of the Hebrew people was true. He was able to put that into words with both the books of Job and the book of Genesis. And then later on he added the other 4 books of the Pentateuch. His response of sharing his worship of God, who made the heavens and earth, becomes a legacy for us today, and is the start of our Bible. It's the beginning of our story. This and so many other things should spur us on to do more ourselves, to give more of ourselves, and to be more, just because of who God is and what He did for this universe, even before we start to look at some of the relational things that He's done for us, which is where I'm going to take you in a couple of weeks' time. Just for today, I want us to stop here. There is more we can cover, of course, and more we will cover. But I want to leave us today with this image of Moses looking up at the stars, looking up and seeing that blanket of twinkling lights above him spread over the earth. Because that is where he worshipped God, such that God was willing to choose him to do something impossible, something that had never been done before and has not been repeated since, bringing the biggest empire in the world to its knees, to walk out of that empire with 1 million people, laden with gold and with silver and with presents from these people, from this empire, and to walk them not just out of that empire, but through the middle of a sea and then across a desert into a promised land. Perhaps it's time for us to take a step back and appreciate the world that God has created, rather than the artificial version of it that we find ourselves living in so often. I think it's time for us to remember who God is as our Creator and what it is that He created. And there is no better time than the Sabbath to do that. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. And if creation sings your praises, so will I. Amen. And most kind and righteous Father in heaven, we thank you for this, your Sabbath day, the time you've set aside so that we can remember who you are, what you've done for us, the creation that you have made, that you have placed us in, and the love and the care that you have for us just in that we can spend this time with you as the all-powerful God who created the whole universe, who created such beauty and such wonder. So many things that we can't even begin to explain. We thank you that you've revealed yourself to us in this way. And we thank you that we can appreciate it and that we can respond, that we can worship you as our Creator God, that we can worship you with our lives, with our words, with our actions, and that we can show the rest of this world who you are and what you have done for us. I ask that you will be with us now as we close this service, and you'll be with us over lunch and as we go our separate ways, that you will bless the remainder of this Sabbath day with us, and that we will be able to come back again shortly to worship you again. We ask this in your most high and holy name. Amen.